Well, okay, so thank you so very much. I'm very, very happy to be here. I love Montreal, so when the conference come up, I decided I'm coming. I almost got a job here, and I got an offer and I didn't take it, but my life would be very different. But anyway, that's another story for dinner. So anyway, I've really enjoyed it. I'm a labor economist. I do educational economics. I thought this was a bit kind of far-fetched, but I've had a lot of fun so far, so hopefully you'll enjoy my paper. So this is joint work with Madalena Davoli, and we got funding from the BBVA. We got a grant to help us with this. So women and men, so women have been converging towards a lot of outcomes regarding men in many economic outcomes. So and in some outcomes they are overperforming, in particular education. But they're converging in the labor market, although that's kind of stalled, and then also in wages. However, there's a place where there's no convergence, or we're not seeing any convergence, which is the level of financial knowledge. So there's a severe and widespread underperformance of women in financial literacy relative to men. And this is kind of spread up, not only across countries, but also across socioeconomic groups. And this is kind of concerning because women earn less than men, about 30%. They also work less, not just they work more per time, but also they spend less time in the labor market than men. And they live longer. So the fact that they have less knowledge about financial literacy means it's kind of like the perfect storm. So we really need to understand these differences financial knowledge, these gender differences in financial knowledge. At the same time, there's quite some evidence that there's gender differences in preferences. For instance, there's gender differences in preferences concerning time, risk, social interactions, and there's a lot of research that has shown that these differences in preferences across men and women have consequences in the labor market, in different outcomes, occupational choice, financial investment, educational decisions, and therefore, potentially, they're also going to have an impact on the decision to learn about financial knowledge. So, what do we know about, what explains these gender differences in financial literacy? Well, there's been quite some work in the last decade that has documented that sociodemographic characteristics explain some of that gender gap. However, it doesn't explain all of it. For instance, there remains an 8 percentage points difference between men and women in financial knowledge, once you control for sociodemographic characteristics in Germany, and 14 percentage points in the United States. And again, once you look at different subgroups, you still find that there's this gender gap in financial knowledge across the college-educated, young adults, high school students. So what is the main objective of the paper? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to try to disentangle whether culture has any say in explaining why there's a gender gap in financial literacy. And not only that, but I'm going to try to explain to kind of identify whether it's culture versus cultural preferences. And I will kind of describe a little bit more about that. So, and I think that one thing that's important is, so we know sociodemographic characteristics matter. We also know that institutions, laws, regulations matter, okay? So if institutions matter, women are going to choose to invest less in financial literacy than men, because, for instance, they expect lower returns from that investment, because there's, higher legal and regulatory barriers for them than for men. Another reason they might invest less is because women tend to be systematically discriminated by financial institutions relative to men. So these are institutional reasons why women would invest less on financial knowledge than men. Alternatively, if culture is what matters, women are going to invest less in financial literacy because they internalize that they're a woman, and that as a woman, they're not supposed to, be good at financial knowledge. So the idea is that, I am a woman, I internalize I'm a woman, and I've been told that women are not good with money or that they're not good at financial investments. And therefore, I don't, in some ways, I don't care about financial knowledge, I care about other things, or I spend time investing in other things than financial knowledge. Alternatively, she might lack preferences on financial interests. As I am a woman, I am not motivated by money, or I just don't care about money. And another one would be the confidence. Because I'm a woman and society has told me that women are not kind of good dealing with money, well, I'm probably not good dealing with money. That would be kind of the cultural explanation behind the gender gap in financial knowledge. And then there's another one, which is the cultural preferences. So if cultural preferences are behind the gender gap in financial knowledge, here what we're going to see is that, so there's this evidence that shows that if you're more patient, you have more financial knowledge. If instead you have higher altruism, you have less financial knowledge. Okay, so this is kind of stylized facts that are out there. At the same time, women are known to be on average less patient than men and more altruistic than men. So if cultural preferences matter, it means that I'm a woman, I know that I'm more patient, less patient and more altruistic, and I also know that those traits imply that I'm less good in financial knowledge. So it's kind of the fact that I'm a woman and I identify as a woman and the knowledge I know implies that I believe that I will not be good. And that's what's driving the gender gap in financial knowledge. Ultimately, the difference between cultural preferences and culture is very kind of small, but so it's just kind of a different way of telling the story, but it matters because if we find evidence of one or the other or of both for different genders, that's kind of useful later on for policymakers, okay? So that's where we are. Okay, so what is our contribution? So I'm going to kind of show you or try to convince you that I'm showing you a causal relationship between culture and cultural preferences and the reduction of the gender gap in financial knowledge. And I'm also going to be able to kind of show the direction, right? It's because there's less of a, as societies or norms become less traditional and men and women converge, then we will find that the gender gap in financial knowledge decreases. It's kind of like that's the direction. I'm also going to show that cultural beliefs regarding gender differences in financial knowledge shape differentially men and women's financial knowledge in the United States. And I'm going to identify which gender differential cultural preferences shape this gender gap in financial knowledge using the data set on Global Preferences Survey, okay? And just kind of to anticipate, it's going to be the preferences that really matter is patience and altruism. Okay, so what do we find? We find that cultural beliefs regarding gender convergence in financial knowledge, beyond those associated with patience and altruism, are associated with women's relative and absolute greater financial literacy in the United States. So, women's beliefs about how they should, how much financial knowledge they should have based on, their identity of being a woman versus a man, explains, is correlated and explains why the gender gap is smaller for women. It's driving that for women. So for women, what matters is the cultural component. Whereas for men, it's the beliefs about patience and altruism that matters. Okay? So that's kind of, and it might be a bit confusing, but hopefully it's going to be clear when you see the data. Okay, so literature review. So we contribute to the literature on, explaining the gender gap via sociodemographic characteristics, but also via differences in non-cognitive skills. We also contribute to a literature that's kind of new that looks at whether culture impacts financial knowledge. The difference between this literature and what we do is that we really focus on the gap, the gender gap. Whereas they focus on, does culture in general, the norms, impact financial knowledge for men and women? And maybe there's a subgroup, a table at some point where they show for men and women separately. But we, the whole purpose of this paper is focusing on the gender gap and seeing whether culture and cultural preferences explain the gender gap. We also contribute to a literature on culture and gender gaps, but on cognitive skills, which is, basically, there's a gender gap in math test scores where men tend to overperform women in math test scores. And there's this work that I've done with Natalia Nollenberger and Almudena Sevilla that shows that culture has a big explanation into this gender gap, okay? And then finally, there's, we're not the only ones kind of worried about this, and Ana Maria and Bottazzi have a paper where they find some evidence that cultural environment in which girls and boys in Italy live, and they measure this cultural environment with medieval commercial hubs and the nuclear family structure in the past, and they show that there's some association between those characteristics in the past and the current knowledge and differential knowledge in financial literacy between boys and girls in Italy. So, what is our contribution? Well, we focus the attention from teenagers' knowledge in financial literacy to adult financial literacy. In our sample, everybody's are adults. So what we're going to do is, another contribution is that because our identification comes from exploiting variation in culture across different countries, we in some ways increase the external validity of the previous results. We disentangle the role of gender differences in cultural preferences from other beliefs related to financial knowledge, and then we find evidence that patience and altruism really matters. Beliefs about patience and altruism really matters for the financial knowledge of men, but not so much for that of women. Okay, so that's where we are. Okay, so how much time do I have here?
So you're 15 minutes.
Okay, so why would culture and cultural preferences explain the gender gap in financial literacy? So identity is defined as how a person's self-image and his or her sense of belonging to a particular social category. And norms, so based on the identity you identify to, norms in society kind of determine how you're supposed to behave. And if you deviate from that, you might feel bad about yourself. So I'm a woman, I identify as a woman, I really believe the norms of my society on how I'm supposed to behave. So if I deviate from what I'm supposed to behave, how I'm supposed to behave, I might feel bad about myself. Alternatively, I might not care about the norms in my society, but if I deviate, I'm going to be punished by the rest of the community, okay? So deviating is usually costly. So, and there's quite some evidence that shows that women tend to be more pro-social than men. They tend to be less negatively reciprocal than men. They tend to be less risk-taking, and they tend to be less patient. So, as societies move from more to less traditional, but also the other way around. So we always think about that the movement goes from more traditional to less traditional, but right now, actually, a lot of countries are kind of going the opposite direction. But anyway, so it's kind of a pendulum. So when we move from more traditional to less traditional, what's going to happen is that, those norms are kind of relaxed, and what we should see is that women tend to behave more like men, or, engage in more traditionally male activities, and vice versa. Okay? So why would culture, in general, affect individuals' knowledge? Well, culture is going to affect individuals' financial knowledge because individuals, men and women, have identified, internalized certain beliefs and values related to the relevance of gathering economic information to make informal decisions, or the need to have precautionary savings and their optimal amount, or the amount of risk that is reasonable to handle, the optimal portfolio. So this is all beliefs that are being transmitted in your society, in your household, that imply that they're going to have that's why culture and preferences impact your knowledge, your financial knowledge. Alternatively, why would culture affect differentially men's and women's financial knowledge? Well, we've seen there's all this evidence that shows that there's important gender differences respecting time, risk, patience, and social interactions between men and women. And since these gender differences have already been shown to affect these economic outcomes in occupational choice, financial investment, and educational decisions, well, why wouldn't they also affect, the financial literacy, the decision on accumulating financial knowledge? So I think hopefully it's now clear what it is that we're doing and why we're doing it. So let me tell you the methodological approach. So the methodological approach, in some ways, we're kind of taking the approach, the epidemiological approach that Raquel Fernandez and Fogli kind of worked on, but we make it quite different. So the epidemiological approach is based on focusing on second-generation immigrants. Second-generation immigrants are individuals that are born in the country their parents immigrated. So they go to the schools. Most of them are not going back to the country of their parents. Maybe they visit the grandma and grandpa, but mostly they stay there. They speak the language. And they obey, and their reference is the host country labor market, educational system, laws, etc. Okay. However, they have different values. Second generation immigrants have different values because their parents come from different cultures. So through their parents and their parents' peers, they're going to embrace different values and norms. And basically, the identification strategy, the epidemiological approach, is to say, okay, let's compare individuals who are all born in, say, the United States or Canada, but whose parents come from very different countries. And we're going to see whether an outcome from the country of ancestry of the parents is correlated with the behavioral outcome of these second-generation individuals. And if we find evidence that it is, well, it can only be that it's some beliefs that have been transmitted. So it's not causal 100%, but it's an association between an outcome from the country of ancestry of these individuals that's correlated with their behavior, like as they grow older. And the only reason it can be correlated is through what they have learned in the household or through their neighbors. So we exploit these. However, we're not going to use second-generation immigrants. We're going to use U.S. citizens. But we have a survey that asked these individuals who may have been in the United States for many generations, what is their country of ancestry? Okay? So in some ways, we move beyond this approach because we really have U.S. citizens. So we don't have all the selectivity issues that you may have with first or second generation immigrants. However, in this approach, and this literature does a very good job at trying to eliminate any confounding effects from the country of ancestry, from economic development, a different level of human capital, literacy, etc. We're going to so this is just a difference, right? You're comparing outcomes from the country of ancestry, and you're associating them with the second generation in the United States. It's just a difference across different ancestries. What we're going to do is we're going to use the methodology that I used in the paper of the math gender gap, which is the same thing. You still work with second generation immigrants in this paper, but now you're doing a different diff. So you're now exploiting the difference in the United States between girls and boys from, say, Germany, relative to the difference in financial literacy between girls and boys from Mexico. Okay, so it's a second difference. So in that way, by taking the second difference, by taking the gender gap, what we're doing is we're eliminating any effect that has nothing to do with gender, but that might still be confounding in the literature of just the straightforward epidemiological approach. Okay, so again, we do exactly this, but what we add to it is that we're not doing it with immigrants or second-generation immigrants or first-generation immigrants. We're doing it with U.S. citizens that are telling us their country of ancestry. Okay, so the data. We're using 3 data sets. The first data set is the one that gives us the micro data, the information. It's basically the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth. It follows 2 nationally representative samples of individuals in the United States over time, and there's 2 cohorts that at some point in time were asked about their financial knowledge. So we have the younger cohort, which was 25 years old when we observed the financial knowledge, and then the older cohort, which is 51 years old when they reported the financial knowledge, okay? And we're going to code that the person is financially literate if they respond correctly 3 questions about financial literacy that are kind of well set up. That's kind of a very standard way of defining financial knowledge. In addition, we have a lot of information, right? So we're going to have not just your regular socio-demographic characteristics, but we have longitudinal. So we have a lot of information about these people when they were 14 years old. We know about whether their parents work, their education, the wealth and financial sophistication of the parents when the person was 15 years old. And then we have a lot of information on household composition, employment, etc. today about these individuals, okay? So these are the questions. I don't know, you probably, I think this crowd is kind of, but these are kind of the questions. So they have to answer correctly these 3 questions for them to be considered financially literate.
Do we have a sense of how long they've been here in the country, the family, the generations? Because that would be another layer of...
Yeah, no, we don't. I don't have that information. No, and some are immigrants, but a very, very small sample of our group are immigrants. Okay, so then what we do, so that's basically our data set that's going to allow us to observe the outcome, financial literacy, and control for a bunch of socio-demographic characteristics and parental, characteristics. So now we need 2 measures. 1, a measure of culture, a proxy for culture, and 2, a measure for cultural preferences. So from the measure of culture, we take it from the Standards & Poor's Financial Ratings Global Financial Literacy Survey, which was designed in 2014, and it was a joint effort of the World Bank, Gallup, and the George Washington University, and Ana Maria was very much involved in this. It's the most comprehensive measure of financial literacy around the globe. It measures the share of a country's adult population that is financially literate by asking 5 questions on 4 basic skills. And so we use it to calculate, we use it to create a representative measure of financial knowledge in the country of ancestry. So we have about, I think, close to 10,000 individuals in the NLSY. They come from 27 countries of ancestry. For each country of ancestry, we use this data set to calculate what is the share of women in that country of ancestry that are financially literate, what is the share of men in that country that are financially literate, and then we take the difference. Okay, so so basically our measure of culture is going to be the difference in the proportion of women who are financially literate in the country of ancestry of that individual relative to minus the share of men who are financially literate, okay? Okay, so to get to cultural preferences, what we do is we have the Global Preference Survey. So this is a different survey that measures preferences in the following domains: patience, risk-taking, positive reciprocity, and altruism. And again, it provides validated measures of these different preferences across the world. And we're going to do pretty much the same. So in this case, what we do is we collapse each preference at the country gender level. We use the sampling weights that they provide to basically come up with what, the percent of women in a particular country that are patient. And the same with men, and we take the difference. It's always the difference between the woman and the man and that's going to be our proxy to measure cultural preferences cultural preferences. Okay?
And these last two data sets, when they get merged with the NLSY, they're coming in as pieces of data, or are they coming in as point estimates with the standard error? These sound like things that you are estimating if something's
Yes.
patient or not.
We're estimating.
Yes, so an estimate comes with a standard error, or are you treating it as
No,
point estimate as data?
we're treating it as
As data?
as data. Yeah, and we're merging it with the country of ancestry.
Yeah, I got that, but
Yeah.
it's a random variable that's being mixed with data is all I'm trying to get at.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm supposed to do that.
Okay, so the
12 minutes.
I still have the clock doesn't move, so it's really nice, but it's not moving.
You have 12 minutes.
Okay, so basically, yes.
Can I ask? So
Of course.
basically, you will be measuring the gap as of 2014, right?
Yes.
But presumably people are bringing the gap from what it was.
Maybe 100 years ago.
More
So-
precise, my son was born in the U.S. I'm just thinking about that. My
Yeah.
son was born in the U.S.
Yes.
I grew up in Russia in less than 90s. So I will be sort of based on this logic injecting some cultural preferences that existed in Russia in 90s into my son, right? But not as of 2014. That will
Right.
be,
No. Right.
and not 100 years ago.
Right. So yes. So you're right. You know, it's ideally maybe, probably ideally I would want to know these country of ancestry preferences exactly the year the parent emigrated, right? And exploit that time variation. But I'm not going to have that because that's not available. I'm lucky enough to have these two data sets that are quite recent that measure financial knowledge and that are comparable across countries and that measure preferences across countries. So that's what I have. So there's a couple of reasons why. So first of all, this is all we have. So if I find no results, I have a big problem. Because it might be that I find no results because culture doesn't matter and preferences don't matter, or that I find no results because my measure is totally diluted because I don't know when you arrived and it's not really good, right? So in some ways, if things have changed a lot and what I'm measuring is your country of ancestry today as opposed to 20 years ago when you arrived, then I might, I would not find an effect. So this is a problem, but it's a bias that's kind of underestimating my results. So the fact that I find results,
Time series, it will depend on what happens in the time series within the country. So if some country becomes suddenly much more financially educated, the other,
right? But
there's a split there.
If I find a relationship, if I find a relationship, it means that it matters. What I won't be able to tell you is, where I'm going to have a bias, and I totally agree with, is about the size of how much it matters. That I agree. But we don't have anything else. If you tell me how to measure it, I'll turn, okay, so.
Just something to acknowledge. That's, yeah.
And it's totally well taken. Actually, there's a slide, but it's coming. Okay, so the way this was measured is what ethnic group do you identify the most, and they could have, I think, up to 3 choices. Of course, if they say United States, we don't count, right? We want them, to identify. So basically, we chose the first choice, if not the second, if it was the US, the second choice, and so on. Okay. And I already kind of made the point that this is a much better measure of ancestry than just using second-generation immigrants or first and second-generation immigrants where there's a lot of selection issues. And also because we're asking these individuals, what's your country of ancestry? So whatever your son is telling me, that's what he feels is his country of ancestry. He could say he feels Italian. I don't know, or I don't know where your wife is from. So if a kid has several countries of ancestry, he will say the one that he feels more attached to, and that's what we're measuring. So in some ways, okay. So in our sample, the gap in financial literacy between men and women in the United States is 14 percentage points, which is basically 29% of the average financial literacy of men, which is 48%. Okay? Okay, so this is the raw data. Here is the financial literacy gap between women minus men in the United States. Okay? 0 is here. So if I put if I put the 0, you can see that most individuals, so most of the gap is negative. So women in the United States underperform relative to men based on the country of ancestry, okay? But in the United States. And the same thing here. This is the country of ancestry gender gap. This is 0. In most countries today, right? In most countries today, women underperform men in terms of financial knowledge. Yes?
Just the number. It's 1/5 of question out of 3 questions. Like, what is the interpretation of the gap?
So the
Minus 0.2. What is?
it's 20%. It's the difference. So we look at what share. So here is the share of women versus men that are financially literate, 1-0, and this is the difference.
That answered all the 3 questions correct?
Huh?
Or
No, if you answer the 3 questions, you get a yes, you're financially literate. If not, it's 0.
just 1 out of 3?
No, the 3. You have to answer the
If
3
you answer
correct.
2 correctly, you're still financially illiterate.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
You have to
So
answer
only
the
if you miss on all the 3, you are okay.
Yeah, but there's some.
Only if you get
all the 3,
correct,
you're
you are
financially
literate.
literate. Okay.
If you get 2 right, 1 wrong, you are illiterate.
Okay.
Okay, so
You're not.
okay, so what do we find? That as we move from country of ancestry where women are more illiterate relative to men, to a country, so for instance, from more illiterate relative to men to women being more literate. So as women converge towards men in financial literacy, the gender gap in financial literacy that is negative in the United States also converges towards 0.
His question leads to an important question.
Yes.
Why are you throwing information away if you've got, let's just take financial.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
Same thing's true of the other.
So we've done robust, this is how the paper is estimated, but we've checked robustness check with alternative measures, alternative ways of measuring financial
Why not just
literacy.
do it right and use the raw data? Why transform 3 questions into a binary count? That seems daft.
So,
It's not actually. It's a very powerful way to differentiate among who has knowledge and who has knowledge.
I don't know what that means.
Yeah, I'll explain perhaps.
Okay.
thank you, Anna Maria. Okay, so empirical methodology. So the outcome is going to be 1-0, whether the individual I living in U.S. region R from country of ancestry J and interviewed in year T has answered correctly the 3 questions on inflation, risk, diversification, and interest rates. Then what we have is a female dummy, which is going to tell us, the gender gap in financial literacy. Then we're going to have the financial literacy in the country of ancestry. That's going to tell us how much the gap in financial literacy in the country of ancestry impacts financial literacy for men in the United States. And then we'll do the interaction, and beta 3 is going to tell us how much the financial literacy gap in the country's ancestry differentially impacts financial knowledge for women. Okay? So if I care about the gap, I'm looking at beta. Financial literacy gap is negative. Women tend to underperform men. So as it increases, it goes towards 0. So if beta 3 is positive, that means that as we converge towards a society that's more gender equal in terms of financial literacy, the financial literacy of women relative to that of men is going to increase. Okay? And the same would be for beta 2. So if beta 2 was positive, it means that as culture becomes more converges, becomes less traditional, men are overperforming financial literacy. Okay, so then we have a bunch of sociodemographic characteristics from the individual, the country, region fixed effects in the United States. So we're comparing people living in the same region in the United States, year fixed effects, and then the standard errors are clustered at the country. Okay, so this is one of the main results. So basically it's the coefficients. In this specification, we don't control for anything. In this, we don't have individual controls. Here we have the individual controls. And here what we do is we're going to have country of ancestry fixed effects. So if you're worried that we don't have enough, there's a confounding effects from the country of ancestry, by having the country fixed effects that deals with it. So beta 3 is this coefficient, the one that I want you to look at, or the preferred specification is the one in the middle. It's positive and statistically significant. Okay. Beta 1 is the gender gap, it's negative. Beta 2 is negative. So if individuals who come from a country where there's more convergence in financial literacy, women tend to perform better relative to men, but men tend to perform worse in financial literacy in the United States. The absolute value is 0 for women. So what I find basically is that, yes, culture matters, but not necessarily in the way, and yes, there's convergence, but it's convergence because men underperform, okay? Which is kind of puzzling, and Okay, so how much time do I have?
2 minutes.
Huh?
2 minutes.
No, 2 minutes. Okay, so I'm going to now go very quickly. I'm not going to show you. You just trust me about all the robustness checks. So the first thing that I want to show you. So how much does this matter? So one standard deviation increase in the gender gap in financial literacy in the country of ancestry is associated with an increase in women's financial literacy of 3.1 percentage points, which is the equivalent of a reduction in the financial literacy gender gap of 28%. It's very big, okay? If we compare, in reference, what does this represent? This is the equivalent of 10% of the effect of having a college degree relative to being a high school dropout for women. It's big, okay? And it's all driven by men. It's all driven by a negative effect on men. Okay, so we are here. So now you're going to say, well, it's probably that you're not measuring, you're confounding other stuff. So one of the usual suspects is, well, there might be some differences in the country of ancestry, economic development, or human capital. So here, the results don't change. That's why I say I'm going to show you a lot of tables where the results don't change. Why? Here, what am I doing? I'm adding a lot of controls at the country of ancestry that measure the literacy at the country of ancestry. And I'm interacting these all with gender, economic development, numeracy rate, okay? Legal origins, the log GDP, nothing changes. Maybe what's going on is that there's some group that's very large in the United States that's driving the results. If I drop one at a time, nothing changes. Okay, maybe what's going on is that at the individual level, there's something happening. Well, remember, I know, whether the parents worked, the education of the parents when he was 15. I know whether they were homeowners, they had stocks, debt, parent savings. I control for all of that. Nothing changes. The results stay. So it's not that. Well, you might say it might be some differences at the cognitive or not cognitive level of the individual. Well, I have that. I know whether they're risk takers. I know whether they're their IQ. I have a lot of information on locus controls. I control for that and interacted with gender. Nothing changes. The results stay. Falsification test. Well, if it's still human capital, it might be something. Well, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to change my outcome. And I'm going to have the height, the weight, whether they're employed or whether they were ever arrested, right? All those outcomes are known to be correlated with human capital. If it's human capital, I should find the effect. Well, I find nothing, right? So it passes the falsification test. Whatever I'm finding doesn't seem to be something related to human capital, okay? So hopefully you believe the result. It's still puzzling that it's driven by negative effect of men. Okay, so I'm going to skip these, but we already know that there's gender differences in preferences, and that, patients, men are more patient, and they're much more and that's, and that makes them better in financial literacy. Women are more altruistic, and that makes them less financial knowledgeable. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to run the same regression, but now the outcome is no longer, the explanatory variable is no longer culture. so the financial gap in the gender gap in financial literacy in the country of ancestry, now it's going to be the gender gap in patience, or the gender gap in risk-taking, or the gender gap in altruism, to see which variable is driving these results. Okay? And what I find is what's in yellow, so the first panel I'm looking at, is it patience? And what I find is men are more patient than women, right? So my gap is negative. When it converges towards zero, toward equality, it increases. So increasing becoming more equal means, in the country of ancestry in terms of patience, means that the financial knowledge of men in the United States drops. I know, I'm almost done. Drops, right? So patience, the beliefs of men and women about patience impacts the financial knowledge of men in the United States, not of women. When we do it for altruism, women are more altruistic than men. So convergence means that the thing goes down, which means, again, more altruism, more convergence implies that men are going to underperform. Women, it's the opposite effect, but not sufficient, so it's underperformance, but less. Okay? So what this is telling me is that beliefs about patience and beliefs about altruism impacts the financial knowledge of men in the United States, and not so much about women. So now I'm going to do exactly the same exercise, but what I'm going to do now is I have done a first regression where I have netted out from my culture variable, I have extracted patience, each of the preferences, one at a time, and then just patience and altruism, and then all the preferences. So now what I'm showing you is the effect of culture regarding financial knowledge, net of patience and altruism, or all of the preferences. And when I do that, the positive effect on women remains, but this is gone, and actually it's positive. So what this is telling me is that for women, culture matters, but what matters is cultural preferences. The fact that I identify as a woman, and I've been told that women don't care about money, or women are not good at money. Okay? So that's why we find that women are not as financially literate as men in the United States. Whereas for men, the story is about their beliefs, about how patient they are, or how altruistic they are, and how that impacts financial literacy. And I'm done. Thank you so much for it.
Okay, well, thank you very much for this presentation. My name is Rodríguez-Planas. I'm going to be discussing the paper on culture and financial literacy. So the hypothesis of the author, very briefly, is that culture has a role in and of itself in shaping financial literacy. So even if you control for things other than culture, so if we control for other socioeconomic factors, culture still remains a determining factor of financial literacy. Okay, so they use data on financial literacy and preferences in the country of ancestry for adults living in the US in order to proxy for culture. And they find that the gender gap in financial literacy in the country of ancestry actually impacts financial literacy in the US. So the paper has potentially an important contribution, because when we think about financial literacy, well, we know that it's important for making sound financial decisions, which is important for all kinds of reasons. So if we know that people with a certain cultural background consistently make worse choices, even controlling for education and such, then that would have important policy implications if the policymaker decides that protecting these groups is an important objective. I think that the paper doesn't even have to be about the gender gap only. I think it's also interesting in just looking at how cultural preferences shape financial literacy overall. It doesn't all have to be about the gender gap. And actually, and that would be my first comment, your dependent variable in your regression is actually the level of financial literacy, so it's not the gap. So,
but beta 3 is...
Yes. So I think that it could be said a bit clearer what are the policy implications. So the finding is that when you have a country where there is where the gender gap in financial literacy is smaller, then men who come from that culture but who live in the US do worse. It's puzzling. I have no idea, honestly. Well, I have some ideas, but it's very puzzling. So what? First of all, what's the causality, or at least what is the explanation here? So, I guess you're as puzzled as me about this result. Is this about? I mean, it wasn't entirely clear to me how long these people had been living in the U.S. So you just mentioned that they might have been living in the U.S. for a very, very long time. So actually immigration, selective immigration, might not be the issue. So my best guess is that it's an institutional thing, that people from certain cultural backgrounds are treated differentially from other people with different backgrounds. So I think the role of the institutions in the U.S. Must play a role here in explaining this. I think this could be teased out a bit better. And the paper actually states that these individuals, so those individuals in the sample from different cultural backgrounds, are exposed to the same educational system and a similar labor market. I am not so sure about that. I'm not so sure that everyone who goes to a school in the US experiences the educational system exactly the same way. So my guess is that, there's research on that depending on your cultural background, you might actually be treated very differently than kids who are either American or from a different ancestry. And so I would not only maybe qualify the statement, but maybe even look at is this maybe actually one of the mechanisms that are at play here. Okay. Also, I still conceptually don't fully understand why gender in and of itself should shape financial literacy. So saying that culture has, that gender has something to do with preferences. I know that there are studies on the role of testosterone and such, so I don't know if that is that has maybe a clear impact on risk aversion. Occupational choices, okay, those are probably very closely linked with preferences, but why knowledge should in and of itself be shaped by culture, I'm still not 100% convinced on that. So about identity. First of all, you didn't mention it in the presentation, but the paper says that you ask people what is your most important identity, so the one that is most salient. And you say that for those who say I identify as an American, you actually take the second most important identity. So I was a bit puzzled by that, because if people have possibly been living here, for many generations, and yes, maybe at some point their ancestors came on a boat from God knows where, well, if that is not important for you anymore, you state it's not important for me, then I'm not sure how you can argue that culture then has a meaningful impact on your motives to acquire financial literacy or not. Another thing is that the degree to which individuals identify with a certain culture, even if they say as their first identity, for example, I identify as a German, one of the more puzzling experiences that Europeans have when they go to the States for the first time is that they meet people who say, oh, you're from Germany, I'm German. And I go, that's cool. And you want to try to talk to them in German, but actually they're not really German. They don't speak the language, they don't really identify with the culture. It's just that it's in the mindset of this country that is a melting pot from all sorts of cultures, that yes, we all have ancestry somewhere in the world, but it's not necessarily really shaping people's beliefs. So even those who do not say I feel American, which I think you should like either leave as a control group or throw out or whatever, but even those who say I identify as Italian, Polish, whatever, it would be interesting if you could find some way of saying how salient culture is for these people. So one thing that you could do is, for example, I'm not sure how much information you have on these people, but if you had, for example, zip code or region, you could look at what is the concentration of people of this ancestry living there, and that might give you pointers to see, okay, well, there's a big community of Germans, Polish, whatever in this region, so it's possibly more salient for people living here than it is for people who live in a total melting pot of all cultures. Okay, yes, so that regarding identity. All right, so measuring financial literacy. I had the same intuition as Glenn, that using a binary variable is a bit puzzling. I'm happy to learn why that is actually a good measure, but I did also think that you're throwing out a lot of information. Another reason why measuring financial literacy can be a bit tricky if you just use it as a 1-0 thing is that we know that women are way more likely to respond do not know, even though they might know the answer. So in the paper by Tabia and others, they found that women say more often don't know, and just that, in fact, explains about 1/3 of the gender gap. And why that might be a problem in this paper is that I'm pretty sure that the propensity to say don't know is related to culture. So the confidence that women have in their ability to correctly answer these questions, if that is impacted by culture, then that's gonna weaken the link that you're trying to create. Okay, so if you have data on the do not knows, do you? I don't know if you don't just have the 0-1.
That's only Ana Maria who has it.
Okay, good. Then forget about it, or talk to Ana Maria. All right. So one other paper that so this is just a working paper, and so this is just a French comment. But I saw that Madalena, your co-author, actually has a paper on how women are worse at multiple choice questions than if you ask them in an open-ended question. If that is something that turns out to be, replicatable, then maybe that again might also have to do with culture. So one thing to bear in mind. Okay, yes, thank you. So in the paper you say that the higher the variable gender gap, so you say your variable gender gap is always negative because women are always worse than men. It's not actually true. Okay. Anyway, so maybe it could be worth looking into a different measure for the distance in genders. You also have like a lot of outliers in this graph, so it might be interesting to also have some information about how sizable these groups are. So there are some groups that I can't really recognize any countries here, but I could imagine that some of the points will actually be not be very meaningful populations with regard to others. Also, I didn't quite understand the paper on the y-axis. It's not the actual gender gap, but it's the result from a regression. Is that right?
No, okay, it's the gender gap.
Yeah, it's the actual gender gap. Okay, because
it's the gender gap.
Okay,
it's the coefficient.
Good.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
It's the beta 3.
Okay. So one other important comment that I would like to make, and the other things I'll send you the slides. you have longitudinal data. So every time that you talk about convergence, about what are other examples, improvement, a reduction in men's financial knowledge, it's a bit confusing because you're not actually observing these. You don't know where the country started. You don't know what development has been in the country, and that actually goes a bit towards the comment that you made earlier. You have the level as of today, but it might actually, how your culture impacts your financial knowledge today might actually also be impacted by the trend that you have been observing in your own country. So if you observe as, let's say, German, and you live in the US, but you've observed that in Germany actually equality has gone up a lot, which I'm not sure about, then that trend in and of itself might actually have an impact on your likelihood of acquiring financial knowledge. So I would just be careful with all these expressions that imply that you're observing trends or anything similar to panel data, when actually we're just talking about levels. We're talking about the level of the gender gap in the country of ancestry and the level of financial literacy currently, and not really about any trends. All right, so yes, I'll stop here.
But I only observe financial literacy at one point. So these are two cross sections. And convergence is always, the identification strategy is comparing countries of ancestry who are more or less. So when we talk about convergence, it's only about gender convergence. There's no time dimension in the paper. There's absolutely no time dimension. Yeah. It's one shot. And we say, the measure that we have of culture is measured today and is a proxy. And, and to the extent that it's poorly measured, is basically, I'm just going to kind of underestimate the effect of culture. So a big problem in this literature if there's no result. So if I don't find a result, we know that editors don't like to publish diff and regression discontinuities with a zero impact. But here, a zero coefficient just means my measure, my proxy is useless. It doesn't mean that culture doesn't matter. I basically can throw away the paper. There's no paper. Okay? I think that the thing that there's 2 points that I want to make that I think I've made them, but I want to just make sure they're clear. The first one is the way our identification strategy rules out that it can be institutions. Because we're comparing boys, men and women that live in the same region. And then we hold constant, you say, well, in the United States, if you're black, you receive a different education than if you're white. Yes, but I'm controlling for race, and race interacted by gender. Therefore, I'm comparing black and white, black women and black men from the same country of ancestry living in the same region, holding constant absolutely everything else. So I think that it's very difficult that this is an institutional story because of the way the methodology is designed. And then I spend a lot of slides and time trying to explain why I think that culture matters and culture might impact my decisions to invest in financial knowledge as a man and as a woman, and why those may be different. So I think that, yes, we know that it impacts a lot of behavioral outcomes. There's a lot of evidence out there. I don't think it's far-fetched to understand that it's also going to impact the decision to invest in financial knowledge. And I think I'm going to leave it here.
Well, if
there's any questions, yes.
So maybe a little bit on this. I was curious to if you had looked on whether the gap is related also to other type of gender gap in the origin country, like labor market outcomes.
So
people who come. Whether is this specific about financial literacy, or is it more, gender gap?
What's
the channel you are identifying? Is it from gap in financial literacy in the origin country or in the? gap in financial literacy
Yeah.
here or in the US. Maybe it's other type of gaps in the
So we have the financial we control for differences at the country level. So the literacy rate, the human capital, all those differences at the country level are controlled for in one of the tables. So if it was a story that, the country of ancestry cares more about men than women's knowledge in general, we control for that, and that doesn't rule out the results. So in one of the tables, we control for the literacy rate and the human capital level and a bunch of characteristics at the country of ancestry interacted by gender. So if it was a story of human capital in the country of ancestry, where my parents come from, countries that value more human capital for men but not for women, right? Once I control for all these differences at the country level, then that would eat up the variation from the financial literacy at the country level. It doesn't. The result is very, very robust to whatever I can put in the model. So it's, in some ways, I know I went very fast, but all those slides kind of, we're trying to make sure that what I'm showing you is not confounding any kind of alternative story of this is not about financial literacy per se, beliefs about financial literacy, but beliefs about, how much men versus women need to learn, or how much, math skills. So I have a specification where I control for the numeracy skills. Right? And I don't find that that's driving the results. Okay, so what I find basically it's an association between two outcomes. One at the country of ancestry, a gender gap in the country of ancestry, and a gender gap in the United States. And I show that this association, which is just a correlation, is very, very robust to adding tons of controls that should wash it out. It doesn't. And then when I do the placebo, I take an alternative measure of human capital as an outcome and say, well, do I still find the relationship? No, I don't. So whatever I find is very, very particular and is associated between beliefs between the gender gap in financial literacy in the country of ancestry and the difference in financial knowledge in the United States between men and women who come from the same country of ancestry. And nothing can wash it away. So it's kind of evidence that there's something that has been transmitted from the parents, from the ancestry, from you, or what you will transmit to your grandkids. It's something stays about those values, but it's not just general values. They're values related to financial knowledge, or values related to preferences. That's what's strong. It's not just, it's not human capital. It's about financial literacy.